Somewhere along the way, a marriage that once looked like it belonged on the cover of a glossy magazine started behaving like a reality show that kept recording long after everyone assumed the cameras had gone home. No wrap party. No final episode. Just the footage kept coming. And the more it came, the harder it became to look away from the specific quality of awkwardness that no amount of professional image management seemed capable of fully smoothing over. And now, years into one of the most photographed, analyzed, and quietly whispered about relationships in modern American public life, late-night television has stopped treating it like sensitive territory requiring careful handling. Jimmy Kimmel, in particular, has stopped treating it like that. He is treating it like an ongoing case study, patient and methodical, adding one small observation at a time until the portrait assembles itself, and you realize you've been looking at it for years without quite seeing what it was showing you. He did not just lift the curtain a little. He pulled it back far enough that the whole setup started to look like it might need to be rebuilt from scratch. Start with the correspondence dinner sequence, because that is where the most concentrated version of this dynamic recently played out, and surrounding context made everything hit harder than the jokes needed to on their own. The dinner had replaced this traditional comedian with a mentalist. The White House Correspondents' Dinner has featured a comedian roasting the room, the president, the press, the vice president, and everyone present for decades. That tradition exists because there is something specifically valuable about political satire performed live in front of the people being satirized. It is uncomfortable in a way that serves a function. It reminds everyone in the room that no position is too elevated to be laughed at, and it does so publicly on the record, with the subject present and unable to leave without the departure itself becoming a statement. Replacing that format with a mentalist in an era when the political environment had become almost satirically resistant to being satirized was a kind of decision that generates more commentary in the replacement than any comedian could have generated in the performance. The avoidance became the story. The gap where the tradition used to sit became louder than the tradition itself. Kimmel's response was characteristically direct. 3 days before the event, he hosted his own version on his show, Tuxedo, a simulated audience of luminaries. Archive footage of Trump, Melania, Pete Hegseth, J.D. Vance, Kid Rock, and Vanilla Ice were assembled from the public record and projected into a fictional dinner that was, in several ways, more honest about what the actual dinner was supposed to do than the actual dinner was planning to be. His opening line, that the president had not wanted jokes made about him, but had also not wanted to pay $130,000 to keep Kimmel quiet, landed the way it landed because every element of it was real. The lawsuit was real. The amount was real. The documented history was real. The only editorial addition was a comedic framing, and even that was barely editorial. He just put the two facts next to each other and let the distance between them speak. The mushroom line followed the same structure. Brief, specific, sourced directly from a documented account that had already entered the public record. When the underlying material is that well established, the comedy does not exaggerate it. It simply points at it with the right timing and trusts the audience to do the rest. The expectant widow joke and the reaction it produced is worth its own detailed examination, because what happened after the joke said more about the current atmosphere than the joke itself did. Kimmel called Melania beautiful. He said she had the glow of an expectant widow. He moved on. It was a roast joke about the age gap between Trump, who is approaching 80, and Melania, who is younger than Kimmel himself. The kind of material that has appeared at every correspondence dinner in some form for as long as the event has existed, directed at presidents and first ladies across administrations without producing particular response this version generated. Melania called for Kimmel to be fired. He addressed it the following morning with the specific calm of someone who had thought through his response before the moment required it. He said clearly that it was a light joke about age difference and not what was being characterized as. He acknowledged the traumatic event she had referenced and said, sincerely and without hedging, that trauma does not require a body count to be real. He said he agreed that hateful and violent rhetoric should be dialed back. And then he added the sentence that became the sharpest moment of the entire exchange. He said a great place to start that conversation would be with her husband. The architecture of that response is worth pausing on, because it demonstrated something about how effective political commentary works at its best. He did not dismiss the complaint. He did not escalate. He took the stated principle seriously, agreed with it openly, and then applied it in the direction it most clearly pointed. The result sounded completely reasonable and was completely devastating at exactly the same time. You cannot argue with the logic because the logic is sound. The only problem with it, from the perspective of the person it was directed at, is that it works. The bruised hands line operated in a different register and deserved its own moment. Considering everything Kimmel had experienced that week with the first couple, he said he was going to declare the footage he had just shown of a particular interaction completely normal for two people who are very much in love. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added that maybe Trump's hands were bruised because Melania kept swatting them away. The laugh that produced was immediate and substantial, but the reason it landed so hard is worth identifying clearly. It was not the invention of a specific claim. It was a naming of a visual pattern that the audience had already assembled from years of footage. The swatted hand, the stepped away from handshake, the expression that arrives on a half-second delay, the body language that reads less like partnership and more like two professionals who have worked out the minimum requirements for a joint appearance and are executing exactly those requirements and nothing additional. Kimmel did not invent any of that. He named it precisely at the right moment, with the right tone, and the audience laughed the way people laugh when something they've been noticing privately finally gets said out loud in a room with other people, and everyone realizes simultaneously that they had all been noticing the same thing. That is the specific comedic skill that makes his Trump-adjacent material work over the long term, not the manufacturing of drama. The identification of what is already visible to anyone paying attention, stated clearly enough that the observation cannot be unseen. The birthday joke sits in a category slightly apart from the rest of the material, and the reason is worth explaining. She is planning to celebrate at home the same way she always does, looking out a window and whispering, "What have I done?" The laugh it produced was genuine and fast. But the joke does not fully belong to the comedy category. It belongs to something closer to a portrait, a brief, specific observation about a person who has been filmed and photographed and analyzed for nearly a decade and who somehow still feels almost entirely opaque, whose actual interior experience of her own life remains essentially unknown to the enormous audience that has been watching it from the outside. There is something in that joke that is not entirely unkind. The "what have I done" is not a mockery. It is an acknowledgement that the life being observed from the outside might look and feel considerably different from the inside, and that the window and the whisper might be the most honest image available of what that interior looks like. Kimmel does not linger in this register, because lingering would tip the comedy into something it is not trying to be, but he visits it regularly enough that the portrait assembled over years of this material has more texture than simple mockery. There is careful observation underneath the jokes, the kind that notices things other people file away without naming. The Rotten Tomatoes line about Melania's documentary was standard roast construction and worked on its own terms cleanly. The 10% critical score was the real documented figure, which meant the joke was almost entirely factual with one editorial addition for color, which is the ideal ratio for this kind of material. The robot entrance at her AI Education Summit produced one of the cleaner visual comedy moments in recent Kimmel history, and it required almost no intervention. One of those robots is Melania. The joke worked because the footage of Melania's entrance alongside a humanoid robot at an event devoted to artificial intelligence and the future technology created a visual juxtaposition that the internet was always going to arrive at independently. Kimmel simply said the thing the internet was already thinking before it finished thinking it. That is timing, not invention. The moment was already there. His contribution was when to point at it and how long to let it sit before moving on. The summit itself, carrying the title Fostering the Future Together and functioning largely as a promotional vehicle for AI and education, was a kind of initiative that generates genuine questions about depth and substance regardless of who organized it. The robot visual elevated those questions into comedy without requiring any of them to be stated as questions, which is a cleaner approach. Show the footage. Make the observation. Let the audience draw the conclusion. Do not explain the conclusion to them. The King Charles sequence brought a dimension into the conversation that the domestic material does not reach, which is Trump in an international setting where the power structure operates by entirely different rules than the ones he is accustomed to controlling. Kimmel's observation that Trump loves being alongside royalty because it provides the experience of watching historically important people defer to him captured something true about how Trump relates to a specific category of prestige and validation. The golden gift with his name on it arrived as confirmation of a pattern visible across every significant state visit and diplomatic encounter. The aesthetic of significance matters as much as the substance of it. A large gold object bearing the Trump name communicates the right things in the right register regardless of what it actually represents materially or diplomatically. What the King Charles material revealed about the broader dynamic was how much of Trump's public image is built around performing at a specific altitude. The validation of royalty, of old money, of historic institutions that carry weight independent of any transaction or election, functions as a category of approval that he has always appeared to find particularly meaningful. The things that cannot be bought or won, only recognized by. The acknowledgement from institutions that existed before him and will exist after him. Kimmel notices this and treats it with a playful attention that sits just short of full analysis, which is where comedy operates most effectively. The observation is made. The implication is left to the audience. The Epstein material requires a different temperature than the lighter segments, and Kimmel handles the temperature shift with enough care that it does not destabilize the overall tone of the commentary. The introduction joke, framing Trump and Melania as people who met through Epstein, was brief and dark and produced a specific laugh that comes with visible discomfort attached. The audience acknowledging the reference while simultaneously acknowledging that they are not entirely comfortable acknowledging it. The Ghislaine-Maxwell sequence moved deeper into that discomfort with a structure that was less purely comedic and more clearly political. The suggested arc of a pardon, a testimony arranged to exonerate, a transfer from real incarceration to comfortable arrangement, and the resigned observation that all the horrible people lived was not a joke at its center. It was a prediction wearing comedic framing. The humor was in the flatness of the delivery, not outrage at what might happen. The exhausted certainty of someone describing how these situations tend to resolve based on accumulated observation of how these situations have resolved before. Kimmel has a specific tone reserved for material in this category. Quieter, flatter, less animated than the energetic delivery he uses for absurdist Trump content. The effect is to signal that the distance between the comedian and the commentary has narrowed to something close to nothing. That what is being said, because it needs to be said. The audience reads that signal and responds differently. More attentive, more willing to sit with something that does not resolve cleanly into a laugh. The 2010 Samsung footage of Trump enthusiastically declaring his love for Kimmel, pressing a handshake, offering come on the show, performing warmth and generosity for a promotional camera, functions as a kind of historical document that gains a different quality each time it resurfaces. It is not being used to make a simple point about hypocrisy. It is being used to mark a distance. The distance between a moment when the relationship between Trump and Kimmel was publicly uncomplicated, when Trump was a television personality who loved attention and Kimmel was a late-night host happy to provide it, and the current moment, in which the First Lady is publicly calling for Kimmel's firing over a mild roast joke about age difference. The distance between those two moments does not need editorial commentary. It does not need to be explained or interpreted. The footage from 2010 and the footage from now sit next to each other, and the gap speaks on its own. The only curatorial decision required is to place them in the same frame. Kimmel makes that decision, and then steps back. This is a long game version of what he does best. Not the single sharp line that lands and moves on. The accumulation of material over time, year after year, that begins to tell a story larger than any individual segment. The portrait that assembles itself gradually from individually small moments until it becomes something that resists being dismissed because it is built entirely from documented footage that nobody disputes. The record is the argument. The comedy is the delivery system. What makes all of this worth examining beyond the individual jokes is what it reveals about how comedy functions as political observation in an environment where more conventional forms of political commentary have largely exhausted their available tools. The press can document, analysts can interpret, historians can contextualize, investigators can report, But comedy can do something none of those disciplines do quite as efficiently in real time, which is to take the gap between the image being presented and the reality being observed, place both sides of that gap in the same frame simultaneously, and let the audience see the distance without being instructed about what to conclude from it. Kimmel's Trummelania material works over the long term because it never fully commits to a single explanation. It does not tell you what the marriage is. It shows you what it looks like in the specific moments when the performance slips and something unrehearsed shows through. It identifies the beats where the script loses a room. It notices the details that manage to sit in plain sight for years without being clearly named, and then it names them with the right word at the right moment, and sometimes with the right pause, and sometimes with the kind of line that carries more weight than a laugh track, can fully absorb, the kind that produces a laugh, and then leave something sitting in the room after the laugh is gone. The relationship between these two people will continue to generate material for as long as both remain in public life, not because anything about it is definitively knowable, but because the gap between the image and the visible reality keeps producing moments that resist disappearing. Each new appearance adds another piece. Each new controversy reframes what was assembled before. The puzzle keeps building. The cameras keep rolling. And Kimmel keeps watching, with the patience of someone who understands that the most revealing footage is rarely the footage anyone planned to provide.